When we think about the Roman Empire, we usually think about how it ended, right? You've got the barbarian invasions, all that political chaos, basically the whole collapse of the West into what we call the Dark Ages. It's like one of the most famous endings in history. But here's the thing, that's only half the story.
Yeah, because while the Western Empire was just falling apart, the eastern half, the part we now call Byzantium, it didn't just hang on. It actually thrived. So that's the big question, isn't it? How in the world did one half of this legendary empire just vanish, while the other half managed to keep going for another 1,000 years? Okay, let's get into it.
All right, so the first piece of the puzzle, and you could argue it's the most important one, it all comes down to one word: Constantinople. I mean, this city was everything. It was the empire's beating heart, its ultimate shield, its single greatest asset, hands down.
Just look at where this city was built. It was a total masterstroke of strategy. It sat right on the Bosphorus Strait, which is the only way to get from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. It was a massive choke point for trade, and that made the empire incredibly, fabulously wealthy. But it was more than just money. The location made it a natural fortress. And what that meant was, even when the rest of the empire was on the ropes, getting hammered by, say, the Persian Empire or later the Arab caliphates, the city itself could just lock down and hold out. It was this unbeatable command center where they could regroup and eventually fight back.
And the defenses they built, absolutely genius. It was all about layers. Okay, so first, nature did half the work for them. You've got water on 2 out of 3 sides. Easy enough. But then, for the harbor, which was a weak spot, they did something incredible. They stretched a massive iron chain right across the entrance, the Golden Horn. No enemy ship was getting past that. And finally, for the only way in by land, they built the legendary Theodosian walls. We're talking a massive, triple-layered system of fortifications that was pretty much impossible to break for almost a millennium.
So here's the key takeaway. Over and over again for centuries, the empire was pushed right to the edge. I mean, they lost almost everything. Sometimes the only thing left was Constantinople itself, but that was enough. As long as the city survived, the empire always had a chance to make a comeback. The city's survival was the empire's survival. Simple as that.
But, it wasn't just about outside enemies. Some of the biggest threats were actually internal. The empire was going through this massive identity crisis. They had to ask themselves, are we still Romans, or have we turned into something totally different?
And this led to a really fascinating split personality, you could say. On one hand, they absolutely saw themselves as the rightful heirs of Rome. They called themselves Romans, and they held on to that title for dear life. But if you looked at the reality of their daily lives, it was a totally different story. The empire was now mostly Greek-speaking. Their culture, from their version of Christianity, the Greek Orthodox Church, all the way down to everyday things like men wearing beards, was becoming fundamentally Greek, not Latin at all. It was this huge, slow-motion change happening from the inside out.
This whole identity struggle really climaxed with the Emperor Justinian. You can think of him as the last of the Romans, in a way. He was obsessed with one thing: taking back the West. And look, he did have some success, but his wars, they were just so costly, so reckless. He poured so much money and so many soldiers into the stream that he nearly bankrupted and destroyed the very empire he was trying to rebuild. So yeah, when he died, the map looked impressive, but behind the scenes, the empire was totally and completely exhausted.
And we all know what happens to an exhausted empire, right? It becomes vulnerable. With Byzantium basically on its knees, its enemies smelled blood in the water. And what came next? Well, it was one of the most brutal and relentless series of invasions any empire has ever had to endure.
I mean, the scale of this onslaught is just staggering. Take a look at this timeline. Justinian's barely been gone for 3 years, and boom, the Lombards grab Italy. Then, a massive quarter-century-long war kicks off with their old rival, the Persian Empire. It gets so bad that a combined Persian and Avar army shows up and lays siege to Constantinople itself. And just when you think it can't get any worse, right on the heels of that disaster, the Arab conquests explode onto the scene. They just sweep through Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and guess where they end up? Right at the gates of the capital. It was a nightmare, a crisis on every single front.
So the empire was just a shadow of what it used to be. It was pushed to the absolute brink of being wiped off the map. And what was left? You guessed it. Once again, it all came down to Constantinople, this one last fortress holding out against a tidal wave of enemies. Which brings us right back to our big question. They were exhausted. They were surrounded. They were completely outnumbered. So how on earth did they pull through? Well, turns out they had a few tricks up their sleeves.
Think about it.
The Arabs had conquered half the known world at this point, and now their navy was blockading the capital. The city's massive walls were great against an army on land, sure, but what do you do about a fleet of warships? What was the Byzantine secret weapon?
The answer was something straight out of science fiction: Greek fire. This was a mysterious, petroleum-based weapon they could literally spray from their ships. The terrifying part? You couldn't put it out with water. It would send enemy ships into, and this is a direct quote, wild, uncontrollable flames. The recipe for this stuff was one of the most highly guarded state secrets of all time. And when the Arabs laid siege to the city with their massive fleets, Greek fire just completely and utterly destroyed them.
But looks, a superweapon alone isn't enough to win a war. You need leadership. And in their absolute darkest hours, the Byzantines just happened to have some brilliant, decisive leaders step up. You had emperors like Heraclius, who personally rallied the army to turn the tide and crush the Persians. And then there was Leo III, who became emperor just as the final biggest Arab siege was starting, and he personally masterminded the whole defense.
So when you put all these pieces together, you start to see the formula for their survival. By around 750 AD, the worst of the storm was over. The empire made it through because 1, it had the unbreakable walls of Constantinople as its final shield. 2, it had a game-changing technology in Greek fire. 3, it had incredible leaders like Heraclius and Leo who showed up at exactly the right time. But just as important was their clever diplomacy. They were masters at paying off one enemy to go attack another, and just pure, stubborn grit. They just refused to give up, even when everything looked hopeless.
So, the empire survived, but it wasn't the same. It had been totally forged in fire, and what came out the other side was a tougher, smaller, more distinctly Greek state, and it would stand for another 700 years, acting as this Christian shield in the East. Which leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. What if it hadn't survived? What if Constantinople, this last shield of Europe, had actually fallen way back in the 7th century? Now that is something to think about.